is so good to see each and every one of you tonight. Thank you for being here with us. If you'd like to open to the book of Hebrews, we are going to be in the book of Hebrews chapter 11 and verses 20 to 23. Hebrews chapter 11 and verses 20 to 23. All right, I'm going to try to say the name of this animal, and I butcher it every time I try, but just bear with me. There is a creature called the diminutive strawberry poison dart frog. I think I said it right that time. It's called the diminutive strawberry poison dart frog. I don't know if they called it poison dart because it has poison or they shoot it with dart. I'm not really sure what the reason is, but that's what it's called. And this dart frog, that's what we'll call him, this dart frog, the parents work very actively to prepare for the next generation. They go to some extremes as far as the animal kingdom is concerned. They lay tons and tons of their eggs, and when all of the eggs hatch into little tadpoles, they live down in South America in the rainforest, where the trees are real tall. The mother will take every single one of those tadpoles, and she will move them up into the trees and put each one of them inside of its own little, whatever kind of water she can find, its own little pool. Because if she doesn't, they'll eat each other. Talk about sibling rivalry, it gets pretty serious. But so she will put all of them in their own little pool, and then she goes for 50 days. That's all she does. She just goes to each pool and she feeds them. And she just goes on all the rounds all day long, feeding them. Meanwhile, the father will kind of guard the perimeter of this, both when they're eggs and then as she moves them all, he expands his perimeter to protect them from whatever predators. And so for more than 50 days, this is what they're doing 24/7. They're moving and feeding and protecting these babies to prepare for the next generation. And so there's a lot of sacrifice and a lot of effort that they are putting into that next generation. But God has given them this instinct to understand that that's going to be worth it for those sacrifices. And this is Christmas Eve, a time when most of us can't help think about our childhood or about our children. And next week, of course, is New Year's, and so thinking about the future is kind of a natural thing to do. And that's why I want to look at Hebrews chapter 11 and verses 20 to 23, because this is very much in line with what those dart frogs do, is thinking about the future and preparing for the next generation. Now, of course, just like all of Hebrews 11, it starts every verse the same way, by faith, by faith, by faith, by faith, by faith. And the reason for that is it's really emphasizing, isn't it, how much they trusted God. They would not have done these things if they did not trust God. And so that's sort of the push behind everything that happens in this. But let's start in verse 20. Hebrews 11 and verse 20. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning things to come. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. And by faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's commands. And so we see all of these people, they did these things because they trusted in God. And the first thing we see from verse 20, as they prepared for the next generation, trusting in God, is they focused on preparing resources for the next generation. And you see this in verse 20. He says, by faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau concerning the things to come, right? Concerning what would happen afterwards. And if you go back to the book of Genesis chapter 27, and look at that blessing that Jacob gave, or that Isaac gave Jacob. Genesis chapter 27, where he blesses his sons. Notice the emphasis of those blessings. This is Genesis chapter 27, and starting in verse 27, when Isaac is ready to bless Jacob, it says, of course he thinks it's Esau, but he says in verse 27, surely the smell of my son is like the smell of a field which the Lord has blessed. Therefore may God give you of the dew of heaven, right? He's going to have the rain and the water that he needs, of the fatness of the earth, plenty of grain and wine, Let peoples serve you, right? These are resources that he has. Nations bow down to you. Be master over your brethren, and let your mother's sons bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be those who bless you. And so when Isaac looked at the future and when he was blessing his son, what he was focused on was they're going to need the right resources. They're going to need all of the wealth or the material goods that they need in order to continue the promise of Abraham, continue the promise to Isaac. And even when you look at what he blesses Esau with in verse 39, this is sort of that impromptu blessing, the unplanned blessing. It's kind of the same thing. Behold, your dwelling shall be of the fatness of the earth and of the dew of heaven from above. And verse 40 is about the conflict between the brothers. But the gist of it is, it's about the resources that the next generation is going to need. And that's, as we think about the next generation of the Graceton Church of Christ. And that's what we want, is we want the Graceton Church of Christ to continue even after we aren't here anymore. We want our children and the people who come here and the people that they convert to be faithful even after we are not here to guide and to lead them anymore. And a part of preparing for that, according to Isaac, is preparing the right kind of resources. Even physical resources are important. And you think about, we can leave behind facilities that are, to the best of our ability, well kept up and paid for, so that they're not having to be concerned, they're just concerned about what's next. Or we can leave behind facilities that are not well kept up and that are sort of a money pit. And you see congregations of the Church of Christ sometimes, they go under for no other reason they can't pay the bills anymore. And there's not a church in town because nobody could pay the bills. They weren't prepared for the next generation to continue the work because they weren't good stewards of the physical resources that they had. And this is, we can leave behind resources of teaching material that's going to help them to continue to grow and to build on, or we can leave behind kind of a headache for them to have to try to sort through and deal with. And it's not that they can't be faithful if we leave behind bad resources, but it does make it harder, doesn't it? And that's not what we want to do. We don't want to make it more difficult for them to be faithful. We want to make it as far as what we can do. We want to make that as easy as possible for them to make those right choices. It's kind of, if you've ever had to deal with death in the family, and if you've ever had to deal with wills, and there's the wills where they just lay it all out. This is exactly what I want. And then there's the wills that it's confusing, or there's just not a will. And families, they don't know what to do. Sometimes they turn to fighting and these distractions because there's not something clear for them to turn to. It's kind of the same idea when we look at preparing resources for the next generation. And so, a really good example of this is found in 1 Chronicles 22. 1 Chronicles chapter 22, as David was thinking about the future of God's people, he knew that he wanted them to build this temple and that Solomon would be the one to build it. But even though David couldn't build it, he still poured in the effort to draw up the plans. He still poured in the effort to gather all of the building materials. He was making sure that when it came down to it and Solomon made that choice, do I follow through with what's next or not? An excuse that he had wasn't going to be, well, it's just too much work because I've got to start from scratch because I don't know what to do. He made that as prepared as he could, and that was right for him to do. And it's good for us to think about the next generation as we deal with our own resources. We second see in verse 21, Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 21, that if we're preparing them with the proper resources, then we're also preparing them for growth. And that's what we see in verse 21. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped leaning on the top of his staff. Now, Jacob had 12 sons, and he blessed each of them. But he blessed Joseph's sons in particular with a kind of a special blessing. And you can see that in Genesis chapter 48. Genesis chapter 48, and starting in verse 15. This is where Jacob blesses the two sons of Joseph. Starting in Genesis 48 and verse 15, it says, God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has fed me all my life long to this day. Now he is literally dying as he says this. And this is by faith. It's because he trusts in God. It's because he knows that God has taken care of him. And so why wouldn't God take care of the next generation? He says, the angel has redeemed me from all evil. Bless these lads, and let my name be upon them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac. And then notice what he asks in particular. He says, let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. He's focused on numerical growth for the next generation, for Joseph's sons. If you go on down to verse 19, remember he switches which one gets the blessing. And Joseph tries to stop him, but he says, no. He says, verse 19, I know, my son, I know. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great. He'll be numerous. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendant shall become a multitude of nations. And so that's why there's 12 tribes, but you don't ever hear about the tribe of Joseph, because Manasseh and Ephraim, his sons, were so numerous that they just called them by those names instead of Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim. And so that's, Manasseh has a huge portion of land because there's so many. Ephraim has two portions, one on the east side of the Jordan, one on the west side of the Jordan, because they have so many people. And so God did bless them numerically. And we see that's what Jacob was passing on to them. That's the blessing that he wanted them. As he thought about the next generation, he thought they need to be able to grow numerically. And isn't that really the purpose of the church? Not just about the numbers. Of course, it's about the spiritual. But that if we are doing God's will, and if we have God's blessing, then an outgrowth of doing God's will is that we should grow numerically. And think about 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 6. 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 6. We've got to do the work of watering and planting, but it's God who gives that increase. And so whenever we grow, that's a reason to rejoice, because we see if it's coming through baptisms, that's God giving us that blessing. And this is what he does. Verse 21, he is blessing them. He is talking about growth. Even as it says he is dying, he is living his last moments. He is so weak, it says that he's leaning on the top of his staff. He can barely stand up, but he pulls himself out of bed to lean on this staff, to say this blessing. And he does it with such great reverence. He does it worshiping God, it says, because he trusts that God is going to provide for them. And that's really the instruction for us is we need to build that right atmosphere for growth. We're providing the right resources, but there's got to be the right atmosphere for growth. So many churches don't grow because they don't have the reverence that Jacob had. They're not building the right kind of atmosphere for growth. We aren't preparing people to know how to teach the gospel. We aren't preparing people to know how to reach out into the community. And that's a large part of what we've been doing here for the past few months, is just trying to learn how to do that. And, as hard as it can be for us, learning to do these cards and learning to visit people's homes, learning to sit down and have a study, if we will put our heart and souls into it, and if we will give it what we have, our children, it's going to be second nature for them. As hard as it is for us, it's going to be easy for them because we're just learning to do these things, but they're doing it there with us. And so when they get older, the idea of signing cards to a bunch of people, well, they've been doing that since they were 3 years old, some of them. It's going to be second nature. Take them with us when we have Bible studies and let them observe as they get older how that works, and so that when they get older, I had never seen a Bible study outside of when someone studied with me the first time that I had a Bible study. And I was like, what do you do? This is intimidating and scary. But I imagine, how do kids learn to do anything best? If you never learned to bake when you were little, you grow up and you try to learn to bake, you're going to make a lot of errors trying to figure it out. But if your grandma or your mom sat you on her lap, and as she kneaded the dough, she grabbed your hands and she kneaded it with you. If she mixed things and you mixed it with her, when kids watch and observe and do with us, it's like second nature for them when they get older. It's the same with evangelism. If they watch and do and grow with us, These things that are difficult for us today are going to be easy for them tomorrow. And imagine what the church can do with a generation of people who find these kinds of things second nature. We've got to build the right atmosphere for growth. 30 tells us in verse 22, if we're working towards numeric growth, then we especially need to be focused on spiritual growth. And that's what verse 22 is about. It says, by faith Joseph, when he was dying, made mention of the departure of the children of Israel and gave instructions concerning his bones. And so this is what Joseph is talking about on his dying breath. He's talking about the Exodus, how they're going to go to the promised land, and they're going to leave Egypt behind. And then he's talking about what to do with his bones. And that's because if you lived back then, what you would have probably believed was that you had to be buried with your family to have rest in the afterlife, right? So what he's really thinking about are spiritual things, and he's thinking about the next life. He's thinking about the afterlife. And that's, we know the New Testament describes the Exodus of Moses, and it puts it in sort of a parallel, sort of a matching kind of thing of when they left Egypt and went through that Red Sea. The New Testament describes that as sort of a picture of us leaving behind sin. It uses that sort of a picture of us coming to the promised land of the church. You can read 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verses 1 through 3 or so. He describes that picture of us leaving behind Egypt and sin and being baptized, he said, coming through that water to find the promised land of the church. And so really we see Joseph's ideas here are very spiritual in nature, and that's what we need to prepare the next generation for, not just to grow. Right? Growing doesn't mean anything if we aren't growing spiritually, if we're not growing in the truth and being grounded. And so we need to prepare them to leave sin behind, to prepare for eternity. We need to prepare them to be people who recognize that the spiritual is more important than the physical, to teach our youth to trust God and to teach them to serve and not just to show up. I had a teacher in school, and he'd say it kind of like this. He'd say, we don't just want their backside in the pews, right? We want their hearts and their hands there too. This is about being here and intending it, loving to be a part of this, meaning what we're doing when we worship. And the only way we can prepare them for that is if it's true of us too. If we are here and loving it and committed and part of everything that we can be, if we are showing them that the spiritual far outweighs anything physical in this life, then we can create an atmosphere that they can carry that forward. And then finally, let's look at verse 23. Verse 23, it says, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents. And so this is starting a section about Moses, but notice verse 23 is actually about his parents and not so much about what Moses did. It says his parents, because they saw he was a beautiful child, and they were not afraid of the king's commands. We need to prepare resources, and we need to prepare for growth. We need to prepare them to be spiritual people, seeking after eternal life first. But sometimes to get there, it takes the right kind of sacrifices. Sometimes to prepare for the future, it takes worthwhile risk. And that's what Moses' parents show us. They say, look at our beautiful child. Right? The king has commanded to throw him into the Nile River and to be done with him. But they saw that he was beautiful. He was something precious. He was something worth preserving. Isn't the future generations of the church, whether they are our flesh and blood children or just the spiritual children that come from the work that we're doing today, isn't the future generations of the church something precious, something worth working for, something beautiful to make sacrifices for, if that's what it takes? They took a risk, and so they weren't afraid of the king's commands. They took that risk, knowing it may cost them even their lives if they get caught, because they knew that generation was worth it. And they saved that next generation because Moses was there to lead it. And so sometimes we have to take that risk, just like they did. Sometimes it may take us disobeying the government if they're asking us to disobey God. And you think, well, what kind of message does that send our children? If the government asks us to disobey God and we say, well, we can't do that. We have to do what God says, just like the apostles did. What that tells our children is obeying God is first and foremost, no matter what the consequences are. And so hopefully it'll never come to that. But if it did, that would be a risk worth taking. It may take financial sacrifices. It may take personal sacrifices. It may even take numerical sacrifices here in the congregation to keep on doing what is right. But if that's what it takes to do the right thing and to show our children what really matters, then those are sacrifices worth taking. You know the phrase, no pain, no gain. And that's true in spiritual things too. Sometimes it takes a risk, it takes sacrifices in order to gain things not just for ourselves, but for the generations that are going to follow. And so by taking the right kind of risk, we are preparing the future generation to be able to follow God's will. And, at the end of the day, whatever we do or don't do, they're going to have to make that choice for themselves. We could create the perfect environment and they still might choose not to be obedient to God. We can't guarantee that. But though it's their choice at the end of the day, we can certainly make it a lot harder on them. We can create an environment where being faithful is more difficult than it has to be. Or we can make that easier on them. We can make it the obvious path to choose. We can make it the simpler path to choose. It depends on choices and decisions and sacrifices that we are making today. Remember, they did these things because they trusted that God would work it out. That was enough for Isaac. It was enough for Jacob. It was enough for Joseph and for Moses' parents. It was enough for Jesus. You read Matthew 16:18. He trusted that God was going to do what was right for the generations of the church to follow. Why should we have any less faith today that God will work those things out if we'll do what it takes to prepare for the next generation? And if there is any way that we can help you this evening, if you need to know more about God's word or about the salvation that God offers, if you need to come and to confess sin or to ask for help or seek out counsel from the elders, we are here for you and we want to help you. And we ask that you come forward as we stand and as we sing.